I am writing this essay having just caught up on the second season of the James Gunn Detective Comics series Peacemaker, starring John Cena. I say this because it's pretty important that you've seen the second season of the show to absorb and contextualize what I have to say here. Going forward, I want to be open-minded about the direction James Gunn and the team behind Peacemaker took this series. I've enjoyed it to a degree I didn't or wouldn't have assumed was likely to happen this time last year, when I was still pretty cold on a lot of superhero properties and hadn't even been following the first season. Having started the series with the debut of the second season after enjoying both Superman 2025 and the Suicide Squad, I have a lot of good things to say about the writing and acting in this series. I think Peacemaker has some of my favorite line reads of any of these superhero shows that I've seen, with a personal favorite character of mine being Adrian or Vigilante, but I was surprised to find that I had a new favorite character almost every couple of episodes, and even the actors who played characters that I loved to hate did such a great job that I found myself really appreciating the choice to have an opening musical number where all the members of the cast danced together. It might be a little unusual, but it's good, and it works in my opinion. But there's a sort of hacky discourse right now that's circulating on social media that I think should be a bigger or more in-depth discussion about this show, and I want to throw my hat in the ring, or my 2 cents or whatever weird overdone idiom works for this situation. You've probably seen, if you're on the bad side of the internet, which is most of it now, that something happens in the 6th and 7th episodes of Peacemaker Season 2. Spoilers for that big revelation you've probably already seen. Peacemaker, as well as his friends following him, goes to Earth X, which is an alternate universe he accesses this season through his dad's old dimensional closet, that is really a door recovered from an alien. It's complicated, watch the show. But Chris is drawn to this universe for a couple reasons. Firstly, his dad and brother are alive and well there, and they're a mostly happy family. Secondly, he has a chance to get with Amelia Harcourt here, although her variant is pretty different. When Chris feels like he's under attack from all sides and doesn't really have a chance with Harcourt, he goes to Earth X to live there permanently. As we learn more and more things about this universe, it starts to feel conspicuous that everything is so different. Something is off. Harcourt, the original one, points this out to Chris when she finds him in the Earth X dimension, and they realize this is the universe where the Nazis won World War II. Chaos ensues, including Economos being caught by Blue Dragon, the alternate White Dragon, and Adebayo being chased down by angry white suburbanites, and narrowly escaping what feels like it was about to be a lynch mob when Judo Master saves her. Also, we get some peak Adrian scenes. It's good stuff. There's a lot of little things that are probably worth discussing with this universe, but overall the big draw on social media has been the fact that what Chris originally thinks is a utopia for him personally ends up being a white supremacist hellhole for others. There's an implicit dynamic where a good, or at least outwardly decent world for some subset of white people comes at a steep cost for everyone else, which is sort of the wet dream of neo-Nazis and white nationalists generally in our own world. I think the most coherent way to read this is through the titular character, Peacemaker, and his self-concept and traumas, but of course the story more broadly engenders some questions about how we portray white nationalism and Nazism. Earth X in the comics, as I understand it, has some details about it and how its deviations in the timeline come about that sort of set up its world to make a little more sense. We are dealing with a world with metahumans and aliens, and all kinds of supernatural elements, after all. But what do we find when we deal strictly with the themes and ideas that Peacemaker has shown us so far? Fundamentally, the proposition of the Nazis winning the Second World War and achieving global domination is a much more profound and challenging conceit for this series' world-building than many people might give it credit for. I've already been showing you some on-screen posts that I've seen shared around from right-wing social media accounts that are so utterly defensive of Nazis and white nationalism, and so profoundly antagonistic against anti-fascism, that it sort of troubles the distinction we have here between the political right more generally and Nazism. The more that white nationalists take over, the more that will continue to be the case, which is of course a very dangerous sign. But is this fictional picture realistic? I've seen a lot of bad takes, and not just right-wing ones. I've seen some random comments from people who seem to think that James Gunn is somehow painting Nazism as utopic in this world, which would of course be rather like Nazi apologia. But I'm not so sure that's accurate either. It's a bit of a problem for analysis of Peacemaker that we don't seem to have a baseline for what actually constitutes a quote-unquote fair portrayal of a Nazi future in fictional settings like this. With that problem in my sights, I returned to the work of historian Ian Kershaw, who has written some pretty compelling work on the Nazis, the Holocaust, and the Second World War. This passage from his book, Hitler, the Germans, and the Final Solution, in particular occurred to me as relevant. Quote, Hitler was irreplaceable in Nazism in a way which did not apply to Stalin in Soviet communism. His position was, in fact, irreconcilable with the setting up of any structures to select a successor. A framework to provide for the succession to Hitler was never established. The frequently mooted party senate never came about. Hitler remained allergic to any conceivable institutional constraint, and by 1943 the deposition of Mussolini by the fascist Grand Council ruled out once and for all any expectation of a party body existing quasi-independently of the leader in Germany. Though Goering had been declared the heir apparent, his succession became increasingly unlikely as the Reich Marshal's star waned visibly during the war. None of the other second-rank Nazi leaders was a serious alternative candidate to succeed Hitler. It is indeed difficult to see who could have taken over, how the personalized rule of Hitler could have become systematized. The regime, one is compelled to suggest, was incapable of reproducing itself. The objection that, but for a lost war, there was nothing to prevent this happening, seems misplaced. The war was not accidental to Nazism, it lay at its very core. The war had to be fought and could not be put off until a more favorable juncture. And by the end of 1941, even though the war dragged on a further 3.5 years, the gamble for world power was objectively lost. As such, the dynamism of the regime and its self-destructive essence could be said to have been inseparable. End quote. This is one of the books I read that really solidified my understanding of Nazism and this sort of form of fascism as a kind of suicide pact. As such, visions of Nazi victory are sort of false as a pretense. If Hitler is a cyborg, or his successor is a metahuman or whatever, maybe the fundamental rules of reality are different and this sentiment no longer applies. But that's just it, isn't it? We're talking about the idea of portraying something real and dangerous and serious under basically unreal and unserious circumstances. So the sense of danger is going to be conveyed differently. Because Nazism was what it was, they could not have won. That, as I see it, is a fact of history. That's not to say that the cost was not immense, and that therefore ending the Nazi regime was not a serious task, but rather that no Nazi utopia was ever on the horizon. Any gains made for the Germans by the Nazis were limited and fleeting in that regard. If I promise you a future and your utter immiseration is built into that future inherently, I would hardly call it a utopian promise, except maybe in the satirical sense, where the word utopia is appropriate. Still, as with Wolfenstein: The New Colossus, which came before, and you can watch my video essay about the Wolfenstein reboot games for some more use cases for Kershaw's work, there seems to have been a temptation for the at least effectively pro-Nazi internet propagandists to present this alternate reality as having some appeal. You mean the streets are clean and people are friendly as long as we get rid of all the minorities? Well, sign me up, is the general sentiment I've been seeing. Of course, this premise is ludicrous regardless. I don't think it's realistic at all to act like something is being achieved here. You can see scenes like the ones from Earth X by going to many affluent white-majority American suburbs across the country. I spent a lot of my childhood in places that looked vaguely like this. Nothing is really on offer here that isn't already present somewhere. You have to be addicted to social media accounts that spam videos of black people stealing from convenience stores, and which share unreliable fake crime statistics to actually buy into any of this rhetoric seriously. No offense, but I'm not going to co-sign killing a bunch of my friends just so I can see the exact kind of neighborhood that I could already see in many places here. That's, kind of an insane proposition if you think about it for more than 5 seconds. That's all discourse that was basically spawned by the 6th episode of Season 2, but the 7th episode directly after, the one with even more great Adrian moments, I might add, has spawned a whole other wave of discussion, specifically around a remark that Adebayo makes when speaking with Judo Master. She says that the world of Earth X, in not so many words, is not too different in some ways from their own world. There's a basic level at which this is an astute observation. After all, in social movements, When major injustices receive backlash, like, say, the overthrow of a king, this sometimes engenders further moves to address further injustices in society, like, say, women's liberation. And we can see this in the history of America. One might argue that freedom as an idea is sort of negatively constructed and mainly exists in opposition to something else, and therefore that the existence of one such opposition engenders criticism of other injustices, and so over time, freedom reproduces with a certain viral tendency. Justice is maybe like a vaccine in that way, which is funny given the opposition of many on the far right to vaccines. Indeed, we can see from far-right rhetoric that this notion of one freedom creating the opportunity for others is readily acknowledged in the opposite direction, as a justification for further injustices and violations of freedoms to preempt the more undesirable ultimate outcomes, which is one reason why people who complain about women's sexual liberation can quite easily come to endorse some of history's greatest atrocities. But obviously there's an elephant in the room, isn't there? And I'm not just talking about the giant Hitler mural that Chris seemingly walked right past without noticing, which is one of my favorite gags in the episode. No, we have to address this, so let's get it out of the way. A lot of the discussion around this show is getting tied back to the MAGA movement and the Donald Trump administration. It doesn't make a ton of sense that this would be intentional in terms of the show's release schedule, since these shows take time to make, but obviously it's been years since the emergence of this movement in Donald Trump's 2016 presidential run, and quite some time as well since white nationalists like Stephen Miller were first in the White House, where he works at the time of this show's release. So it's not like this wasn't going to be a known parallel regardless. Personally, I think this is probably one of the less interesting elements of the show, but here we are. Let's return to Kershaw for some more insights. Quote, "The inherent instability of charismatic authority in this manifestation, or the specific content of the charismatic claim, was rooted in the utopian goal of national redemption through racial purification, war, and conquest, implied then not only destructiveness but also self-destructiveness. Hitler's own suicidal tendencies could in this case be said to reflect the inbuilt incapacity of his form of authoritarian rule to survive and reproduce itself. The fact of the matter remains that the theme of national revival in the face of national embarrassment is sort of endemic to the American right. What that national embarrassment actually is might be a little harder to pin down. For the Germans, the outcome of the First World War, then the Great War, and Germany's subsequent disempowerment and economic downturn is usually the most frequently cited example of a motivation for this sort of sentiment. For America, the question might feel a little more odd because American global power was at least relatively secure, or so it seemed, prior to the first Trump administration. Was it just a response to something we only imagined? Well, setting aside that white nationalism and Nazism are inherently built on lies, there are a few components I'd like to highlight. First, and perhaps most obviously in hindsight, the neoliberal turn of the 1980s and 1990s that occurred in several Western countries, including the United States, and established a new pro-corporate and anti-regulation political consensus, set the stage for a failure to recover from subsequent downturns, such as the 2008 housing crisis and bank bailouts, that prompted populist energy for movements like Occupy Wall Street and the current progressive left. But war and race are almost just as relevant. Social media has set the stage for heightened public perception and increased circulation of information on racial injustices, but it has also, in addition to deregulation, like the end of the Fairness Doctrine, as well as a failure under the new consensus to establish any real equivalent without authoritarian attempts to regulate internet environments, aided in the snowballing of right-wing political commentary that has produced the information environment we see today. This has in turn conditioned the right-wing response to the election of the first black president of the United States, objectionable policies and practices notwithstanding. The United States of America has also failed in increasingly public ways to achieve its military aims in some of the most nonsense military engagements with some of the most publicized war crimes in the country's history, ranging from the coverage of the Vietnam War to the lie that created the Iraq War. The fallout from September 11th and America's forever wars has clearly been disastrous for the nation's political and media environment, including a lack of real recompense for the liars and criminals who created those problems. One can only shudder at the ominous prospect of similar fallout in the wake of the United States' complicity in the Gaza genocide. It's difficult to actually parse these issues into real antecedents for the political consequences we are seeing and will continue to see. The point is that there are historical causes for these social crises, and so some Americans have been taken for a ride by the so-called Trump train to a similarly non-existent utopia. While there remain discrepancies between the American situation in the 2020s and the German situation in the 1930s, we can return to Kershaw to see how that vagary and indistinctness of ideology might actually be a part of the project. Quote, "The essence of the Hitlerian charismatic claim was the mission to achieve national rebirth through racial purity and racial empire. But this claim was in practice sufficiently vague, adaptable, and amorphous to be able to mesh easily with and incorporate more traditionalist blends of nationalism and imperialism, whose pedigree stretched back to the Kaiserreich. The trauma of war, defeat, and national disgrace, then the extreme conditions of a state system in a terminal stage of dissolution, and a nation racked by chasmic internal divisions, offered the potential for the charismatic claim to gain extensive support, stretching way beyond the original charismatic community, and for it to provide the basis for an altogether new form of state." End quote. What I think these quotations show overall is that there is no Nazi America, not in this or any other version of our history, that does not itself radically reimagine the Nazis themselves, except perhaps for the Nazi America that the Americans are capable of making. As such, the American flag with the swastika instead of the stars, if it were to really exist, would not be a symbol of Nazi conquest from Nazi Germany, of these United States of America, but rather a symbol of an ascendant nativist American movement. Adebayo's remark that our reality, for her meaning one with its metahumans, aliens, and the like, is not too distinct from Earth X, is therefore extra poetic. The symbolism of a Nazi America should rightfully be one that rallies us around our values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, pun intended. If we abandon those values, we're abandoning the underlying logic of freedom, and I think in some ways, that's really what this plot beat in Peacemaker is really about. In a larger sense, it's about Chris's trauma and how he both fails to recapture his past even as he fails to imagine a future for himself. But maybe that's why an anti-Nazi plotline is so important to this show after all. Thank you everyone for watching. Be sure to check out my channel for more goodies like this, and if you're interested in supporting what I'm doing, I've got YouTube memberships officially open and my Patreon, as always, linked in the description. Please stay safe out there.